Hello. Welcome to the Rare Books Department at the J. Willard Marriott Library, the University of Utah. My name is Louise Poulton. In this virtual visit to the Rare Books Department, we look at books made between the 8th century and the 21st century. These parameters reflect important changes in the way books were made, why they were made, and for whom they were made. At the early point is the great European manuscript tradition. The end point is the fine press movement, reflecting our desire to retain the grandeur and physicality of what is read. During this broad period, an extraordinary shift in the technical method of production of books changed the way we write, the way we approach literature, the way information is transmitted. Our focus will be on medieval manuscripts and how their design influenced books made in the modern print era. We refer to books produced before the development of printing with movable type as manuscripts, which means handwritten. Because manuscripts were made by hand, each one of them is unique. Manuscripts are often described as illuminated, a term to which there is some objection. In the world of books, illuminated strictly means decoration that included gold or silver, which sparkled when it reflected light. In this period, that light would have been candlelight. But like gold and silver books, all books, whether illuminated or not, were treasure. In Christian Europe, some books were as precious as sacred vessels, vestments, relics of apostles and martyrs. One manuscript was exchanged for a man's best horse. Another was ransomed for gold. Books reflect an appreciation for the written word and a conscientious determination that the written word was known and passed on from one generation to the next as the treasure it was and is. In the early Middle Ages, the making and keeping of books was essentially a monastic pursuit. Monasteries were the centers of knowledge, the focal points of intellectual and artistic life up until the 12th century. The production of books became an integral part of monastic life. The Emperor Charlemagne, a descendant of the Frankish tribesmen partly responsible for the fall of the Roman Empire, went about cultural reform in the same vigorous way he vanquished his enemies. He built a scriptorium at Aachen, employing a British scribe to oversee the copying of classical manuscripts remaining after decades of neglect and the ravages of war. One reform developed at Aachen was to create a new and very simple script that was introduced to all parts of the empire with Charlemagne's typical aggressive efficiency. The script is known as Carolingian minuscule and is small and very round. It was compact and quick to write and easy to read. The majority of manuscripts of the classical texts were copied using this script. When the Italian humanists of the 15th century rediscovered classical texts, most of the manuscripts dated from the Carolingian Empire. The humanists wrongly assumed that they had found original Roman manuscripts. They began to imitate Carolingian minuscule. When the art of printing was introduced into Italy, the first Italian printers adopted this neat, round handwriting and called the typeface they've created after it Roman. We still use Charlemagne's script today, as in our Times New Roman font. The GODESCALC EVANGELISTARY was commissioned by Charlemagne and his wife Hildegard. Written by the scribe GODESCALC, it was produced at Aachen between 781 and 783. This evangelistary was made to commemorate Charlemagne's march to Italy, his meeting with Pope Adrian, and the baptism of his son Pepin. A dedication poem includes details of Charlemagne's march and is signed by the scribe. The poem compares the book's gold and silver with the stars, an example of the early medieval belief that the written words of the Gospels directly reflect Christ's divine nature. Charlemagne and Hildegard are both mentioned at the end of the manuscript as this book's patrons. The GODESCALC Evangelistary is the earliest known example of Carolingian illumination, a fusion of early Christian and Byzantine styles. The artist used elaborate shadings in light and dark to give the figures depth. An evangelistary is a book containing particular passages from the Gospels, which are read during Mass throughout the liturgical year. In this manuscript, the Gospel readings are written in gold and silver ink. The script is on a purple background with framed embellishments. Purple dyed pages, or leaves, as they are called in manuscripts, are rare. The color purple signified royalty, earthly and heavenly. It was extraordinarily expensive to dye parchment purple. Only the wealthiest could afford such a book made, and they could only do this for especially important documents. Even people who could not read, and most people in 8th century Europe could not, recognized this book as treasure. Its purple dyed pages, its gold ink, told of its importance, the importance of the owner, and of the contents. Books were equated with extreme wealth. Gifts of books hastened the reception of foreign ideas and learning, but a king both received manuscripts and presented them as objects with a real financial value. In one instance, books were exchanged by English and German kings on the occasion of a wedding between the two families. In another, a king decreed in his will that his library was to be sold and the proceeds given to the needy. Often, a secular ruler might give a luxury manuscript to a monastery in return for prayers for his salvation. A monastery might make and offer a similar manuscript to a king in hope of patronage in return. Either way, the investment was in a valuable book. Why was this book so elaborately ornamented? There was a theological reason for ornamentation. The Gospels contain the revealed Word of God, and this Word was honored by elaborate ornamentation announcing its mystery and complexity. The impression of the holiness of the text is enhanced by its decoration. Ornamentation served as protection for the books as well. Crosses, for instance, were symbols to ward off any evil that might befall such treasures as books. And there was a practical reason for ornamentation. It was used to aid in finding one's way about the Gospels. There were no chapters and verses. Initials of varying size separated text into visually recognizable sections. From late antiquity, there was a custom of enlarging the first letter of a section and then coloring it in. The initial letters of sections were sometimes painted in by the scribes while they were writing out the book, but more often space was left for another to fill in with color. These initials, often lettered in red, were called rubrics, from the Latin ruber, for the color red. A rubricator would fill in the initials. Sometimes the scribe would leave a small, faint letter to aid the rubricator. Then the rubricator would lightly sketch in with charcoal the design of the letter. For circles and curves, they might use a compass, which would leave a tiny but visible hole pricked in the middle of the design. The design would be picked out in pen and ink, and then filled in with color. Manuscripts usually opened with a very large, often ornate first letter. Smaller capital letters would indicate other subdivisions of the text. Initials would vary in size, depending upon their position and function within the text. Overall, the size of initials would help classify priorities of text. Such functional decoration was used in nearly every manuscript produced. The hierarchy of ornamentation in medieval manuscripts is indicative of the medieval world's strong sense of organization and rank. The beginnings of this psalter are rubricated with ornamental initials. The manuscript was produced around 1195 in northeastern France. It is named after its first owner, Ingeborg, a Danish princess and spouse of King Philip II Augustus of France. She was expelled by her husband for unknown reasons shortly after their wedding. The illuminations in this work represent a turning point in the history of European painting, when artists left behind abstract and highly stylized forms in favor of a more naturalistic representation of the world. The three-dimensional qualities of the figures, their proportions, and their expressive movements stand out as essential innovative elements in the emerging Gothic style of the early 1200s. The calendar included in the Ingeborg Psalter has wonderful examples of these figures depicted in activities illustrating the months. Signs of the zodiac indicate seasonal shifts. Here are February and March, Aquarius and Pisces, and a man warming his foot by the fire. Here are April and May, with depictions of the ram and bull. And here are Gemini and Cancer, June and July, and the shearing of a sheep. Leo and Virgo, August and September, and the harvesting of crops. October and November, Libra and Scorpio, and a man crushing grapes beneath his feet. December and January, Sagittarius and Capricorn. The expressive movements of human and animal subjects in the miniatures bring the medieval world to life. More lavish illuminations painted on fields of gold depict the scenes from the legend of Theophilus. In this popular medieval epic, the sinner Theophilus devotes himself to the devil and is saved by the Virgin Mary, thus introducing the Faustian motif for the very first time. This manuscript belonged to a young woman of the Veronese aristocracy. Produced on vellum in the second half of the 13th century, it is illustrated throughout with miniatures and consists of 42 folios, or 84 pages. A note of ownership indicates that the manuscript was entrusted to the monastery of Santa Maria Maddalena in 1350. This monastery thrived between 1200 and 1300 as a harbor for young women. The book contains a prayer to the Virgin Mary and one of the oldest known prayers written in the Veronese vernacular. The rest of the manuscript consists of legends of Saint Margarita of Antioch and Saint George of Cappadocia. The legend of the Holy Margarita, a shepherdess of Antioch, tells the story of the prefect Olibrio, who falls in love with Margarita. Her refusal of his advances was deemed an act of rebellion against the Roman Empire. Margarita was tortured and beheaded. Graphic miniatures illustrate the story of the tribulations of George of Cappadocia. Georgius, born about 275 BCE, was the son of a Roman army officer from Cappadocia, present-day Turkey, and a Syrian mother. He served as an officer in the Roman army. He declared his Christian faith to the Emperor Diocletian and was tortured for 7 years, but never recanted, for which he was eventually beheaded. The story ends with an illumination for which this legend is best known. Saint George astride a horse, piercing with the lance a dragon led on a leash by a princess. This manuscript is an exceptional example of early interconnection between text and illustration, as small paintings weave in and out amidst the written word. This interplay of text and image was used as an instrument in helping the viewer, if not the reader, comprehend the divine message. This manuscript was likely commissioned by Lady Eleanor de Quincey, who lived from about 1230 to 1274. It was produced around 1252, probably in London. The text, in Jerome's Latin Vulgate, includes extracts from an 11th century theological commentary on the Book of Revelations. It, too, contains the legend of Theophilus, depicted here in a strikingly different style than that of the Ingeborg Psalter. The universities of Europe, beginning with the great cathedral schools, blossomed from the late 12th century on. A need for textbooks brought about a revolution in medieval book production and created a commercial book trade. The shift from monastic book production was directly affected by the rise of universities. The days of the cloistered scribal monk working only for the glory of God on his manuscript, were over. By the mid-13th century, the secular book trade was taking over much of the business of manuscript production. A customer would pay a bookseller, not the scribe, for a manuscript. A bookseller would act as the agent for commissioning new manuscripts, using the hands of many different scribes. The bookseller, or stationer, did not usually do the work himself. Scribes and professional illuminators would subcontract with the bookseller. The bookseller, parchment maker, scribe, and illuminator would all be part of an extensive enterprise. The customer would choose just how expensive he wanted his book to be. In Paris, around 1300, there were about 30 booksellers. Scribes would often be students making books for their own use and supplementing their allowances by working for a stationer. At the same time in Paris, there were about 45 illuminators, some of them women. Many people involved in the production of books had other trades as well. Scribes and illuminators might also have been bookbinders, lawyers, or innkeepers. The copiers and illuminators would have worked under the guidance of a workshop master. Many hands took part in the manufacture of this book, a classic example of early workshop production. Illuminated apocalypses were fashionable in England when this manuscript was produced. The commentary was added to ensure that the reader was correctly guided through an understanding of the biblical symbolism. Illuminations helped with this guidance, but they also served as a statement on the owner's social position. The more lavish the production, the more prominent the owner, or at least the more wealthy. The book was intended to educate, but also to entertain. St. John's revelatory vision of the end of the world was a popular subject for medieval illustration. Emotionally powerful images of clashing armies of angels and demons and terrestrial and celestial upheaval were evoked by the text. The 78 miniatures in the Lambeth apocalypse include the dragon being cast into hell and Christ sitting in final judgment. It is not often that scholars can identify either scribe or illuminator from the increasingly sophisticated workshops. Styles of illumination, however, can be identified within one workshop or another, and sometimes the identity of the painter. Scribes were sometimes identified, often by signing their own work. This manuscript was written, or scribed, by Francesco de Savardi in 1337. The first leaf of each of the three main divisions in this copy of Dante's Divine Comedy is illuminated. The introduction to each canto is in red with ornamental initials. This late 14th century Bolognese copy of the Divine Comedy contains two scholarly commentaries and a fragment of a poem. Each of the cantos are introduced with a miniature depicting the contents of the text. In this scene, the artist depicts the three beasts and Dante's companion Virgil, each of which appear at different times in the first canto of the Divine Comedy. At the opening of Inferno, Dante alludes to the apocalyptic vision set within the biblical book of Revelation. Waking up to find himself in a dark, overgrown forest, a dazed Dante, the pilgrim, encounters a leopard. Next, his path is blocked by a lion, asserting itself as the ruler of the land, and thirdly, a wolf. The three symbolize carnal sins, malice and fraud, violence and ambition, and incontinence. More commonly, these are known as lust, pride, a group of lions is referred to as a pride, and greed. The three stop the pilgrim from climbing to the top of a mountain. Dante, the pilgrim, then sees a human figure and turns to it for help, although at first he cannot determine whether the figure is a man or a shadow. The shadow introduces himself as the ancient Roman poet Virgil. Dante begs Virgil to help him escape the danger surrounding him in the wild forest. Virgil counsels Dante to turn in a different direction, explaining that the wolf will remain on earth until a savior liberates it. The savior will nourish the earth with wisdom, love, and virtue, driving the wolf into hell. But, says Virgil, to be saved, Dante must first go through hell and purgatory, and then offers to guide him in this path. However, to get to heaven, the pilgrim will have to find another companion. Virgil, born before the spread of Christendom, is a good person, but not Christian. As a pagan, he cannot enter heaven. Dante accepts Virgil's help, and the two poets begin their journey. The unfamiliar viewer of the story might assume from the image that all five of these characters, the pilgrim, the leopard, the lion, the wolf, and Virgil, meet at the same time in the same place. Medieval art had a wonderful way of erasing both in its imagery. The manuscript is incomplete. Empty spaces were left for miniatures for the songs of Paradiso and Purgatorio, and it is likely that only one scribe is responsible for the text. Handbooks of health were one of the most popular treatises on medicine during the Middle Ages. They combined Arabic and Western knowledge on plants with reference to their useful and harmful properties. This illuminated medical handbook was produced for a layperson, a woman of the upper aristocracy, or of a rich patrician family, able to read and afford a lavish book. A reference of sorts for the household management of health and healing, this type of book goes back to an Arab source written by the physician Ibn Butlan in the 11th century. The Arab art and science of healing decisively influenced Occidental medicine and enjoyed a long-lived and distinguished reputation. The Latin translation, which made the Codex accessible to the educated of the medieval Western world, was widely known. Many copies survive. Beginning in the 14th century, the text was placed below an individual image. The miniatures give us evocative portrayals of everyday life of late medieval culture. With a natural style and strong colors, the two artists portrayed plants, animals, food, and drugs. All of the objects are within scenes centered upon a human. This particular copy, produced in northern Italy, is one of the finest of its kind, displaying over 200 full-page miniatures of all that was considered important with regard to human health and well-being. The text below each miniature describes both the benefits and shortfalls of the object depicted, based upon Ibn Butlan's text. Ibn Butlan, originally from Baghdad, visited Cairo about 1049, after which he went to Constantinople before settling at Antioch in Syria. Handbooks of health derived from the classical herbal tradition, but were closely related to Arab manuscripts. The form of the book creates an appearance of simplicity. In fact, books are complex pieces of engineering and technology. Medieval bookmaking involved craftspeople with extraordinary skills and abilities, not to mention ingenuity, discipline, patience, and stamina. At the end of one book, a scribe added, "The art of scribes is hard compared with all other arts. The work is difficult, hard too to bend the neck and plow the sheets of parchment for twice 3 hours." Parchment makers, illuminators, rubricators, ink makers, paint makers, pen makers, brush makers, bookbinders, booksellers, and, of course, authors might all have written similar complaints. From the support, that is, the material upon which lettering and decoration are laid, to the materials used to inscribe and illustrate, to the way a page and group of pages are designed to please, evoke, and invoke a reader to pursue and ponder the thought within, to the structure that holds it all together, these books are very personal objects, creating an intimacy between writer and reader that is hard to replace. but replace we did. 50 years after our example of a handbook of health was made, a new technology, also requiring complex skills and ingenuity, discipline, and stamina, changed the way books were put into hands forever. Movable type was first used in Europe around 1450 in mines by Johann Gutenberg, a skilled goldsmith. Gutenberg developed a cheap alloy of lead, tin, and antimony to make his type. Each piece of type was a different letter or diacritical mark. Each piece of type could be used again and again in any combination. Gutenberg developed an ink using copper and lead oxides, modified with linseed oil. The ink used by Gutenberg was similar to the oil-based paints used by painters in the 15th century. Gutenberg adapted this paint for printing. Gutenberg also adapted the designs of olive oil presses and the presses used in mills to squeeze the moisture out of damp pieces of paper. He used these designs to develop a new kind of press for a very different purpose. Gutenberg's idea was to print books. One book could be reproduced many times within a relatively short period of time. Of all the technological revolutions of the last 500 years, Johann Gutenberg's invention of printing was the most far-reaching. Throughout history, the ability to read and write had been confined mostly to small groups of nobles, priests, and scribes. Gutenberg's development of movable type helped make a much broader literacy possible. The printing press brought about mass communication, and the consequences touched the entire world. At first, printed books were made to look as much like manuscripts as possible. Type was cut to mimic the scribal hand. Like manuscripts, there were no title pages. The handwritten and illuminated manuscript was the model printers worked from. The innovation was in speed and size of production, not style. Not yet. The new industry grew quickly. By 1470, several presses had begun in Nuremberg and in Basel. Within 50 years of Gutenberg's printing press, by 1500, there were more than 100 printers in Venice alone, the largest printing center in Italy and one of the largest in Europe. There were print shops in at least 40 towns in France before 1501. In Paris alone, there were 60 shops. There were printers everywhere, in every city all across Europe: Padua, Mantua, Naples, Rome, Antwerp, Utrecht, Delft, Leiden, and more. In the earliest years of printing, religious texts were the most often printed. These were fairly lavish productions and expensive. Soon, however, printing was swept up in the spirit of the humanist Renaissance. The early printers found demand for texts in the vernacular, grammars, math, astronomy, medicine, and law. Local and national histories were printed, travel literature, and Latin classics from Virgil, Ovid, and others. One of the best and most prolific of the early printers was Erhard Rotdolt in Venice. This is one of his books. Boethius, Roman philosopher and statesman, was appointed consul of Rome in 510 CE. A minister under Emperor Theodoric, Boethius was falsely accused of treason, imprisoned, and sentenced to death. According to tradition, he wrote his great work, The Consolation of Philosophy, while awaiting execution. His treatise on ancient music was also for many centuries unrivaled as the final authority on Western music. Boethius's Arithmetica was produced by Erhard Rotdolt as part of his extensive program of astronomical and mathematical productions. The early printed treatise is typical of the classical works used in Western European Renaissance education. When we think about the early world of printing and bookmaking, it is important to remember this: material was rare and costly. Labor was relatively cheap. The papers lining the binding of this book are proof sheets of Boethius's Arithmetica, the book we just looked at. Somehow these proof sheets made their way from Augsburg in 1488 to Nuremberg in 1500, from Rotdold to Anton Koberger, and remained intact until they were used to line the binding of this book. Remnants of an unidentified manuscript lie underneath the Boethius proof sheets. Type was another rare and costly commodity. In spite of these hindrances, printing was a huge success. Within the first 50 years of Gutenberg's press, more than 12 million books were printed, representing 30,000 different titles. Most editions averaged 400 copies. Books became less expensive. More people were able to possess their own copies of books. By 1530, a 24-page pamphlet cost the same as a loaf of bread. A copy of the New Testament was equal to a laborer's daily wage. In spite of the rapid growth of the printing industry, manuscripts and the printed book coexisted for some time. But as printers became more skilled and innovated at their craft, printers came into their own. They became famous for the quality, beauty, and design of their work. Petrus Lombardus, Peter Lombard, was a medieval French theologian. He taught at the Cathedral School of Notre Dame, and toward the end of his life he became Bishop of Rome. Sententiarum Libri established his reputation and subsequent fame as a writer. It was written between 1148 and 1151, and is a collection of teachings of the Church Fathers, plus some opinions of medieval masters. In it, Lombard recognized the role of reason in theology. Until the 16th century, it was the official textbook of theology in many universities. Hundreds of scholars wrote commentaries on it, among them Thomas Aquinas. This particular edition was printed by Anton Koberger, one of the more significant of the early printers. Koberger published more than 200 editions. Because Sententiarum Libri was used as a textbook, it has no decorative initials or other ornaments. What is striking is the typesetting. The main text, Peter Lombard's text, is centered on the page, while commentary surrounds it. A gloss, a systematic series of explanations or interpretations regarding a particular text, is surrounding the main text. Glosses, or marginal notes, which might consist of annotations or translations or summaries or, in this case, commentaries, were a format used in medieval biblical theology. Glosses were studied and memorized for their own merit. In manuscripts, glosses were, of course, added to a page of text by hand. In early printing, the glosses had to be set with type. In both cases, determining the page layout would have been very tricky. Our copy of Koberger's printing of Lombard's work is bound in contemporary calf over oak boards, with blind-stamped panels on the sides. The binding is decorated with a roll depicting a hunting scene. A manuscript note on the title page suggests that it once belonged to the monastic library of St. Elizabeth of Brescia, which is where it may have been bound. Printing famously played a part in the explosion of scientific scholarship. The same is true of literary scholarship. Printing meant that scholars across Europe were able to work from identical books. Scholarship became a collaborative effort rather than a solitary pursuit. Printing facilitated research and international exchange of information and ideas. For the first time ever, there was a wide dissemination of classical, Judaic, and Christian sources all at the same time, everywhere. In other words, now everyone could be, literally, on the same page. Not all pages were big or lavishly illustrated. Small, simple books provided outstanding scholarship and forceful messages. Printers often played a role in emphasizing an author's argument with typographic skill. The son of a poet and the product of a thoroughly humanist education, Francesco Giambullari became secretary to Alfonso Orsina, the widow of a Medici. Her patronage gained him lucrative positions at a parish church. In 1550, he became librarian at the Library of Florence, the first to hold this position. Between 1541 and 1548, Giambullari gave a series of public lectures on Dante's Divine Comedy. Giambullari's work on the Florentine language was part of his effort to validate the writings of Dante. He began his work on Dante in 1538, and his reputation as a Dante scholar quickly grew. Giambullari was a staunch supporter of a rather obscure movement to support Florentine culture and language. This treatise on Dante's Inferno includes an alphabet he designed to teach Florentine pronunciation. Giambullari claimed that the Florentine language was not derived directly from Latin, but rather had its roots in Aramaic via Etruscan. Printer Neri d'Ortolata was a pseudonym for one of Giambullari's friends and supporters of his promotion of modern spoken Florentine based on this theory. D'Ortolata was particularly creative in his printing. This book is a lecture on the location and shape of Dante's Inferno. D'Ortolata, who used pre-existing typesets, used different typefaces to represent the sound of Giambullari's proposed pronunciation of Florentine. Along with the promulgation of pre-nationalist tendencies based on language and culture, literature also became a vehicle for political and philosophic principles. This is likely the fourth Latin printing of Thomas More's Utopia. The edition also includes History of Richard III, on which Shakespeare based his play, a piece written while imprisoned in the Tower, and other pieces. In this collection of More's works, the printer set the text in two languages, using two separate type fonts, one in Latin and one in Greek, using an italic typeface for the Greek. Additionally, the printer used different sizes of typefaces, floriated initials, and purely decorative devices to guide the reader through the text on the page, very much like medieval manuscript makers used on their pages. On this spread, we see more fancy typesetting. The pendentive, elegantly ending a passage, was a feat of typesetting based on manuscript conventions. For the reader, a pendentive signals a transition from one passage of text to another. Utopia, first printed in 1516, is a satire on the administration of Henry VII, illustrated by a fictional ideal state. The literary form, most likely based on Plato's Republic, was later adopted by Francis Bacon and Thomas Hobbes. The title has become a word synonymous with an optimistic but impractical social reform. The book addresses, among other social ills, religious intolerance, extreme punishment for crime, unjust taxation, and disparity of wealth between social classes. The protagonist discovers Utopia while traveling with Amerigo Vespucci, after whom the American continent is named. In Utopia, there is no war, no crime, and no poverty. Thomas More refused to subscribe to a new oath required by the Act of Secession, passed in 1534. For this, he was cast into the London Tower, where he was kept, tried for treason nearly a year later, convicted, and beheaded. Despite More's death by government, his work continued to be published. Printing seditious material was often dangerous for the publisher. Much of English Catholic polemics came from the presses of Louvain or Antwerp, run by sympathetic printers. From here, the English writings found their way back across the Channel, as had the printings of Protestant exiles in the first half of the century. This printer, Pierre Zangre, held the printing rights of More's works and placed his print shop's device prominently on the title page. Printers' devices were ways that publishers marked and marketed their wares, and often contained elaborate, if not obscure, symbolism. Here, A fountain is set within an historiated, meaning depiction from life, frame. We've looked mostly at medieval manuscripts and only touched on the printed page and its effect on the world of ideas. Early manuscript book design had a strong influence on early print. After all, the technology was new, but not necessarily the general purpose, to capture ideas and keep them for generations to come. Readers and writers tend to want written words to look and work the same. This is not some Luddite factor. The evolution of the written word and how it is presented is complex. Conventions were done of necessity and with deliberation in order to aid reading. Technology does and did, however, change the way we approach the written word. Printing with movable type made new ideas possible and gave those ideas an extended life. The next two books will seem like an odd jump, but I think they demonstrate the continuing power of the page, both textually and visually. At the end of the 19th century, when books had become commonplace and the art and quality of the production had diminished, William Morris, an English designer and socialist, repudiated mass production with all its uniformity and standardization. In 1891, Morris founded his Kelmscott Press. He wanted artistic control over every aspect of book production, from type design to ink to illustration to binding. He commissioned special paper and designed the watermark the mill used for this paper. Morris was particularly enamored with medieval manuscripts, and the design of his books referenced their general style. He designed his books in homage to them. He had artists like Edmund Burne-Jones and the appropriately named Dante Gabriel Rossetti produce much of the ornamentation for his books. These artists, with Morris leading the way, were a part of the pre-Raphaelite movement, replacing what they considered the poor standards and bad taste of the day with arts and crafts movement, which preached that both fine arts and useful arts should be beautifully and finely crafted. This book was printed in black and red and contains a wood-engraved title, borders, half borders, ornaments, and initial letters. Can you see the references to medieval manuscript production? We began this lecture with the magnificent book created for and in honor of Charlemagne, produced nearly 1,300 years ago. Charlemagne remained a source of inspiration for storytelling since that long ago time. In the early 20th century, the love for the written word, contemporary and ancient, also continued. The Song of Roland is a French epic dating from about 1040 to 1115 CE. It recounts the chivalric and heroic deeds of Charlemagne, based on an historical but minor 8th century battle. Roland was a nephew of Charlemagne. The author of the legend is unknown. The epic is considered the first masterpiece of literature in the French vernacular, written as a chanson de geste, song of deeds, in 4,000 lines. In spite of, or perhaps because of, its status in French literature, it was not translated into English until the late 19th century. This edition was translated from Old French by Isabel Butler. It was designed by Bruce Rogers, one of the great book designers of the 20th century. 7 illustrations derived from the compartments of the window of Charlemagne in the Cathedral of Chartres depict events in the legend of Roland. These have been drawn and printed and then colored by hand in blues, reds, greens, and yellows after the stained glass of the window. A large arched headpiece vignette tops the opening text like an umbrella. Roundels are placed throughout the text. The text is printed in double columns with marginal notes in brown ink. typefaces are French Betard and Civilité. Betard was a black letter script used in France, the Burgundian Netherlands, and Germany in the 14th and 15th centuries. The script was a decorative chancery or legal hand dating from the 13th century. Civilité is a type designed by Robert Gragnon as a response to the Italian italic. Gragnon based the font on a cursive Gothic script. The typeface was first used in 1559 for a book on manners written for children by Erasmus. This masterpiece of referential and reverential book design was printed on American handmade paper and bound in quarter vellum over printed boards in a fleur-de-lis pattern taken from printings in the crypt at Chartres. To achieve an antiqued effect, Rogers rubbed a red paste wash over the printed paper. The detailed work from start to finish surely matches that of some of the medieval manuscripts we saw at the beginning of this lecture. Only 220 copies of this book were printed. Bookmaking is inspired by and promotes a continuation of conversation as a way to capture all sorts of stories, fact or fiction. Because of books and the care with which they were made and the care with which they were kept, we have an intimate knowledge of Charlemagne and Hildegard and Pope Adrian, the Psalms, the Gospels, Princess Ingeborg and King Philip II Augustus of France, the legend of Theophilus, legends of St. George of Cappadocia and St. Margarita of Antioch, Lady Eleanor de Quincy, the medieval vision of the end of the world, Dante, and perhaps the greatest literary work in the Italian language, thoughtful contemporary and Renaissance commentaries on Dante's work, medieval Western and Arabic medicine, Ibn Butlan, Boethius, a 6th century philosopher, Peter Lombard, a 12th century theologian, Thomas More, a social philosopher, and William Morris, another English social philosopher, whose love for the written word spurred him to continue the creation of beautiful books. I invite you to come to the Special Collections Reading and Reference Rooms on the 4th floor of the Marriott Library to hold these books and others and experience their living and intense intimacy. For more about the Rare Books Department, its collections and services, please subscribe to our blog, Open Book, scroll through our digital exhibitions, view more virtual lectures, visit our website, and thank you.